December 21st, 1945, a general died. The Nazi war machine had been destroyed. After 6 years, after 60 million dead, after cities reduced to ash and bone, it was finally mercifully over. That is the story everyone knows. Here is the story nobody tells. On that same day, in a field somewhere in Soviet-controlled Poland, 200 miles east of Berlin, a group of American soldiers stood behind barbed wire and watched the sun go down. They wore American uniforms. They carried American dog tags. Some of them had survived Stalag 17. Some had survived Stalag Luft 3. They had endured German guards, German winters, German hunger. They had waited years for liberation. Liberation had come. On May 3rd, Soviet troops had swept through their camp, torn down the swastika flags, and told them the war was almost over. The Americans had cheered. They had shaken hands with their liberators. They had believed, with every fiber of exhaustion in their bodies, that they were going home. Instead, they were marched east, away from American lines, away from Allied territory, deeper into Poland, deeper into the unknown. And when they asked where they were going, the Soviet officers smiled and said the same word over and over. Processing. To understand what happened next, you have to understand one document. February 1945. The Crimea, the resort town of Yalta on the edge of the Black Sea. 3 men sat together at a table and divided the future of the world. Franklin D. Roosevelt, already dying, his face gray and hollowed by the illness that would kill him 2 months later. Winston Churchill, exhausted, watching the British Empire slip through his fingers in real time. And Joseph Stalin, who had lost more than 20 million of his own people in this war, and who had not lost his appetite for power. They signed many things at Yalta. Agreements about Germany, agreements about Poland, agreements about the post-war order that would define the next 50 years. And buried inside the document in Article 3, Section B, was a single sentence that should have been simple. All prisoners of war liberated by Allied forces shall be returned to their country of origin as rapidly as possible. Rapidly, not eventually, not when paperwork allows, not when it becomes convenient, rapidly. Everyone shook hands, everyone smiled for the cameras. And then 3 months later, the war ended, and the Soviets did not return the prisoners, not rapidly, not slowly, not at all. His name was Robert Shaw, 28 years old, Captain 3rd Infantry Division, United States Army. He had been captured in late 1944 during the grinding advance through Germany, held in a German transit camp near Dresden, and liberated by Soviet forces on May 3, 1945. He remembered the moment the Soviet troops arrived. The gates opened. Men were crying. Some dropped to their knees. A Soviet officer, young, maybe 20 years old, walked through the camp with his rifle slung over his shoulder and announced in broken English that the war was finished and they would be going home soon. Shaw had believed him. For 3 days, he believed him. He and roughly 300 other Americans waited, rested, ate the thin soup the Soviets provided, and waited some more. On May 5th, they were told to line up outside the camp. They were being relocated, the Soviet officer said, for processing, for medical evaluation, for documentation. Temporary, he said. Very temporary. They marched east. Shaw noticed it immediately. East was wrong. East was deeper into Soviet territory. East was away from everything that meant home. He asked the officer. The officer said, soon. He asked again the next day, soon. On the 3rd day, he stopped asking. He started paying attention to something else instead. The sun, the stars, the direction of the wind, the position of the guards, the timing of the shift changes, the sections of fence that were watched, and the sections that were not. They arrived at the new camp on May 8th, the day the war officially ended. The swastika flags were gone. Red banners with hammers and sickles hung in their place. The Americans were given bunks. They were fed. They received basic medical attention. The Soviets were not cruel, not in the way the Germans had been. There were no beatings, no starvation, no systematic terror. There was simply no exit. Every few days, new Americans arrived from other camps across Soviet-controlled territory. Shaw began counting 100, then 300, then over 1,000 in his camp alone. And from fragments of conversation with Soviet guards who let information slip, he understood there were other camps, similar camps, all across Poland, Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, thousands of Americans, none of them going home. Shaw made a decision on May 28th. He was leaving. He had spent the previous 2 weeks studying the fence the way a student studies for an examination. He knew which guard tower had the laziest rotation. He knew which stretch of wire in the northeastern corner of the camp sat in a shadow that no searchlight reached between 2 and 3 in the morning. He had found a piece of wire dropped near the latrines and had spent 8 days sharpening it against a concrete floor, slow and quiet, a few minutes each night. At 2 in the morning on May 28th, he moved, not running, walking, slowly, deliberately, keeping low, staying inside the shadows. 20 minutes to cut through 4 strands of wire. He counted his own heartbeats to stay calm. Then he was through the fence and standing in the darkness outside the camp, and the strangest feeling passed through him. Not relief, not joy, something quieter than that. Determination. He did not run then either. He walked into the forest and disappeared. For 3 days, Shaw moved west. He slept in the forest during daylight and walked at night, navigating by the stars the way soldiers are taught, the way his father had taught him when he was a boy in Ohio. He drank from streams. He ate whatever he could find. He was exhausted and thin and running entirely on the understanding that every step west was a step towards something that mattered. On May 31st, he heard the sound of engines, American engines, with a different pitch than Soviet trucks. He climbed a low ridge and looked down at a road, and there was an American convoy moving through what was now American-controlled territory. He stood up, he walked down the slope and onto the road, arms raised. A jeep stopped. The driver looked at him for a long moment. "Who are you?" "Captain Robert Shaw, 3rd Infantry Division. I escaped from Soviet custody. There are thousands of Americans still behind wire. Someone needs to know. The debriefing happened within hours." Shaw sat across a table from military intelligence officers who listened with expressions that shifted slowly from skepticism to something much more serious. He told them about the march east, about the camp in Poland, about the arrivals, the counting, the conversations with guards, about the other camps he had heard about but never seen. The report went up the chain of command, division to corps, corps to army, army to the desk of the man who would have to decide what to do about it. General George S. Patton was 59 years old in the summer of 1945. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the posture of someone who had spent his entire life believing that how you stood in a room told people everything about what you were willing to do in it. He wore 2 ivory-handled revolvers at his hips, not because he needed them anymore, but because he had always worn them. And George Patton did not change his habits for anyone. He had commanded the Third Army across France, through the Ardennes, into Germany. He had moved faster than any general in the European theater, driven his men harder, asked more of them, and in return had given them something rare in war: the sense that the person in charge actually intended for them to survive it. His soldiers did not merely respect him. Many of them, in the particular way that soldiers feel things they never say aloud, loved him. He read Captain Shaw's report on June 3rd, 1945. He read it once, quickly, then he set it down and read it again, slowly. Then he called for Colonel Oscar Koch. Koch was Patton's intelligence chief. He was a quiet man in an army full of loud ones, methodical, precise, the kind of officer who understood that in intelligence work, the most important thing is not what you know, but what you can prove. He had been gathering information for weeks, quietly, without being asked, because Koch was the kind of man who gathered information the way other men breathe. Continuously, without thinking about stopping, he came into Patton's office with a folder How many? Patton said. Koch opened the folder. He had names, ranks, serial numbers, unit designations, German camp locations where the men had been held before liberation, dates of liberation by Soviet forces, testimonies from soldiers who had escaped, like Shaw, reports from intelligence contacts inside Soviet-occupied territory, reconnaissance notes from Allied aircraft flying the border regions. We cannot give you an exact number, sir, Koch said. The Soviets have not provided any documentation, and we have no access to their records. But based on everything we have gathered, our estimate is that the number runs into the thousands. Multiple camps, multiple locations, Poland, Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, all consistent reports, all pointing in the same direction. Patton looked at the map on the wall behind his desk. The red line cutting through the heart of Europe, East and West, Allied and Soviet, the geography of a world that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. These men survived Hitler, Patton said. He said it quietly, which for Patton was more frightening than shouting. They survived his camps and his bullets and his winters. And now they are sitting in someone else's camp waiting for someone to come and get them. He turned back to Koch. I want every piece of documentation we have sent to Schaff. Every name, every testimony, every location. I want it on Eisenhower's desk. And I want it there today. On June 10, 1945, Patton sent the complete file to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force with a direct message to General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The message was formal, precise, and utterly unmistakable. Thousands of American military personnel remain unaccounted for, last confirmed in Soviet custody. Yalta Agreement mandates immediate return. Request immediate intervention with Soviet command. Eisenhower received it. He read it. He understood exactly what Patton was asking for. And then he forwarded it to the Soviet liaison, politely, diplomatically, through proper channels, with the tone of a man who genuinely believed that proper channels were the correct response to everything, including the imprisonment of thousands of American soldiers by an ally who had already proven it did not read the same rule book as everyone else. The Soviet response arrived on June 13th. Eisenhower called Patton. George, he said, we have a problem. Patton arrived at Schaff headquarters within 2 hours. Eisenhower handed him the Soviet response without speaking. Patton read it standing up. We have reviewed American claims regarding prisoners of war. We find no evidence of American military personnel in our sector. All liberated prisoners have been processed according to Yalta protocols and returned to appropriate Allied authorities. If American command believes otherwise, they are mistaken. Our records are complete and accurate. Patton set the paper down on Eisenhower's desk. They are lying. His voice was very quiet. We have the names, Ike. We have the testimonies. We have men who walked out of those camps and told us exactly what is in there. And they are sitting in Moscow telling us these soldiers do not exist. Eisenhower nodded. He did not disagree. He could not disagree. The evidence was what it was. I know, George, he said, but this is now a diplomatic matter. We have to handle it carefully. The alliance is fragile. We still need them in the Pacific. Patton looked at his old friend, the man who had promoted him, protected him, tolerated him for years, and who was now asking him to be patient while thousands of American soldiers waited in the dark somewhere east of the border. Carefully, he said. He picked up the Soviet response and set it back on Eisenhower's desk. I heard you, Ike. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The war with Stalin for those prisoners was just beginning. And unlike the war with Germany, this one had no clear front line, no obvious enemy, and no guarantee that the right side would win. June 15, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 5 weeks. In Washington, politicians were already arguing about the post-war budget. In Hollywood, studios were planning films about the victory. In American cities, families were hanging welcome home banners and buying new suits for sons who were coming back. In a conference room at Schaff headquarters, 4 of the most powerful military commanders in the Western world sat around a table and argued about patience. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery spoke first. He was 67 years old, precise, controlled, a man who measured words the way he measured artillery ranges. He said what the room already knew, but no one wanted to say out loud. The Soviets are difficult partners. They have always been difficult partners, but they are partners. We cannot afford a diplomatic rupture over this matter. These men will be returned eventually. We must be patient. Patton sat across from him and said nothing for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, patient, not a question, just the word, hanging in the air like smoke. While we are being patient, he continued, thousands of Americans are sitting in Soviet camps. These men walked out of German camps. They are not bargaining chips. They deserve to come home. Eisenhower raised his hand, the gesture of a man who had spent his entire career managing people who were smarter and more volatile than the situations they were in. George, sit down. We all want those men home, but we have to think about the larger picture. Patton did not sit down. Ike, he said, the larger picture is that the alliance is already a fiction. Stalin is not building a partnership with us. He is building an empire. He is installing governments in Warsaw, Budapest, Prague. He is moving borders. He is erasing countries. And we are sitting here worrying about offending a man who is already doing everything we would call an act of war if anyone else did it. The room went quiet, not because Patton was wrong, because he was right. And everyone in that room understood it, and understanding it changed nothing about the political reality they were all trapped inside. Eisenhower made his decision, diplomatic pressure through proper channels, no military action, no provocations. Patton saluted. Yes, sir. His face said something else entirely. That night, Patton sat alone in his quarters in Bavaria with his maps and his thoughts. He had a habit, when a problem refused to resolve itself through official channels, of spreading his maps across whatever flat surface was available and simply looking at them. Not analyzing, not calculating, just looking the way a man looks at a river when he is trying to understand which way it is moving. The maps showed him what he already knew. The camps, according to Koch's intelligence, were concentrated in 3 regions. Western Poland, just across the Soviet occupation boundary. Eastern Germany, in the Soviet zone, close to the demarcation line, and northern Czechoslovakia, where Soviet forces had moved in the final weeks of the war and simply stayed. The nearest camps were less than 50 miles from American-held territory. 50 miles. He had moved his army further than that in a single day during the breakout from Normandy. The next morning, Patton met with his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay. Gay was 51 years old, a cavalryman by training and temperament, one of the few men in the entire Third Army who could read Patton's silences and understand what was being said inside them. He had served alongside Patton since North Africa. He had learned, over years of proximity to the man, that the most dangerous version of George Patton was not the one who was shouting. It was the one who was quiet. Patton was quiet. He pointed to the map. He traced the line between American and Soviet zones with one finger. Then he pointed to 3 locations east of that line. Here, he said, here and here. These are where they are. Gay studied the map. What are you thinking, sir? I am thinking, Patton said, that Stalin spent 20 years watching the West ignore him and then another 4 years watching us underestimate him. He understands one language, not diplomacy, not letters, not formal requests sent through liaison officers who get lost in Soviet bureaucracy. He understands presence. He understands the question of what happens if we are actually serious. Gay waited. I want to put units at the border, Patton said. Not across it, not threatening it, just there, visible, close enough that every Soviet observation post between here and Warsaw knows we are standing at the door. Gay was quiet for a moment. That will look like a threat, sir. Patton looked at him.
Good.
But Patton needed authorization he did not have. Moving divisions was not something a general did alone. not even a general of Patton's standing, not in 1945, not with the political weight of every decision pressing down on the entire Allied command structure. He needed Omar Bradley. Bradley was 52 years old and had the face of a man who had spent the war trying to keep brilliant, difficult people from destroying themselves and each other. He had commanded the 12th Army Group, Patton's direct superior, and he had performed that role with the particular exhausted grace of someone who understood that his job was not to be the most talented person in the room, but to be the one who kept the room from catching fire. He arrived at Patton's headquarters on the evening of June 18th. They had known each other since before the war. They had served together in North Africa, Sicily, France, Germany. They had seen the same things, lost the same kinds of men, made the same kinds of impossible decisions in the dark. Bradley poured himself a drink and sat down and looked at Patton. "George, I heard about the Shaft meeting. You stirred things up. Those men deserve more than diplomatic letters, Omar." Bradley set his glass down and looked at the maps. He already knew what Patton was going to say. He had known since he accepted the invitation to come. Patton laid it out, moved Third Army units to forward positions near the Soviet zone, not provocatively, visibly. Tanks, artillery, infantry. Park them at key crossing points along the demarcation line. Let the Soviet observation posts see them. Let that information travel up the Soviet chain of command until it reaches someone who has to make a decision about whether holding American prisoners is worth whatever comes next. Bradley listened to all of it. Then he was quiet for a long time. "If you do this," he said, "the Soviets may interpret it as preparation for something larger. They may move forces in response. This could escalate in ways neither of us can control." Patton nodded. "Let them calculate the risk. Every Soviet soldier they move to watch us is a soldier with a rifle pointed in our direction instead of pointed at the men in those camps. The more it costs them to hold our people, the sooner they decide it is not worth the cost." Bradley stood up and looked at the map for another long moment. He thought about the orders from Washington. He thought about the war in the Pacific, still raging, still consuming American lives at a rate that made every political calculation in Europe feel like arithmetic on the edge of a volcano. Then he thought about the men in those camps. "I will approve limited redeployment," he said finally. "One armored division. Supporting units, forward positions near the Soviet zone. But George, you do not cross that line. You do not engage Soviet forces. You do not give them any justification for anything. This is pressure, not war." "Understood," Patton said. Bradley picked up his glass. "I hope you know what you are doing." Patton looked at the map. "I know what I am not doing," he said. "I am not leaving those men there." There is something that neither Patton nor Bradley said aloud that evening, because men like them did not say certain things aloud. But it existed in the room between them, as real as the maps on the table. Washington did not want a confrontation. Not because Washington did not care about the prisoners, but because Operation Downfall was being planned in rooms that Patton did not have access to. The invasion of the Japanese home islands, a military operation so enormous, so costly in its projected casualties, that the planners spoke about it in the careful language of people describing a catastrophe they had accepted as necessary. American commanders expected to lose hundreds of thousands of men on the beaches of Kyushu alone. Soviet entry into the Pacific War was not optional. It was essential. Every military calculation about the invasion of Japan ran through Moscow. Stalin's cooperation was not a preference. It was a variable that American lives depended on. Patton's tanks on the Soviet border could cost more American lives than the prisoners he was trying to save. He knew this. Bradley told him directly, quietly, with the tone of a man delivering a fact he wished were not true. Patton absorbed it. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "If we let them keep those men, we are telling Stalin that there is no price for taking Americans. We are telling him he can do it again, and he will. Bradley had no answer for that, because it was also true. Within 24 hours, orders went out. The 4th Armored Division, one of the most experienced armored units in the European theater, began moving east. It was a deliberate movement, unhurried, visible, of M4 Shermans, M18 tank destroyers, artillery batteries, infantry companies. They moved along roads that Soviet reconnaissance could see. They did not try to hide. The point was to be seen. On June 22nd, American armor reached forward positions along the demarcation line between American and Soviet occupation zones. The tanks stopped there, engines idling, gun barrels pointing nowhere in particular, just present, immovable, a question with steel in it. Soviet observation posts reported immediately. The message went up the chain of command at speed. American military buildup on the western border of the Soviet occupation zone. Armor, artillery, infantry, posture, unclear, intent, unknown. Marshal Georgy Zhukov received the report within hours. Zhukov was 48 years old and had spent the last 4 years fighting the most brutal war in human history on a scale that Western commanders could barely comprehend. He had defended Moscow when everyone said Moscow would fall. He had broken the siege of Leningrad. He had commanded the final assault on Berlin. He had seen things that left permanent marks on a person, the kind of marks that do not show on the outside, but change the way a man looks at every situation he encounters afterward. He was not a simple man. He was not a villain. He was a Soviet officer of the highest rank, operating inside a system that rewarded obedience and punished initiative, trying to manage an occupation zone that was dissolving into chaos while waiting for instructions from Moscow that arrived slowly and sometimes not at all. The prisoner situation had been on his desk for weeks. He knew the camps existed. He knew Americans were in them. The problem was not malice. The problem was what the Soviet system produced when no one gave a clear order: inertia. Officials at every level waiting for someone above them to decide. Forms being processed by offices that had no authority to process them. Requests for documentation going to departments that no longer existed. Men sitting behind wire, not because Stalin had specifically ordered it, but because no one had specifically ordered anything else. And underneath all of that, something Zhukov understood but could not say directly. Some of those Americans had seen things. In the final weeks of the war, as Soviet forces swept through Eastern Europe, there had been incidents: looting, brutality, behavior that violated every law of war and that Soviet command had chosen not to document. American soldiers in Soviet liberated camps had witnessed some of it. They were, in the blunt language of intelligence work, inconvenient witnesses. Zhukov had sent the question to Moscow: what do we do about the Americans? Moscow had sent back the thing it always sent back when it did not want to make a decision: silence. And then American tanks appeared on his border. On June 23rd, Zhukov contacted Eisenhower directly. The conversation was formal, careful, two men who understood exactly what the other one was doing and chose their words accordingly. "Why are American forces massing on our border?" Zhukov said. "This appears to be a hostile act." Eisenhower's response was measured. "General Patton is concerned about American personnel in your custody. He wants to ensure their safe return according to Yalta protocols. This looks like a threat. It is a reminder of our mutual obligations. The Yalta Agreement requires rapid return. It has been 6 weeks. We want our soldiers home." There was a pause, long enough that Eisenhower could hear the weight of it. "Your soldiers are being processed," Zhukov said. "This takes time. We have millions of displaced persons. The situation is complex. We have their names," Eisenhower said. "We have their ranks, their units, their serial numbers. We have testimonies from men who escaped your custody and walked to our lines. We know they are there, Marshal. We want them returned now." The silence this time was longer. "We will review our records," Zhukov said finally, more carefully. "If American prisoners are present in our sector, they will be identified and returned appropriately. How long will this review take?" "Days. Perhaps a week, no longer. Zhukov agreed, and then the call ended. And in that moment, something shifted, not dramatically, not with any declaration or announcement. It was just a quiet pivot in the machinery of a situation that had been locked in place for 6 weeks. Inside the camp in Poland, Private James Morrison did not know any of this. He was 22 years old, from a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and the war had taken sons from almost every family on every street. He had been captured in late 1944, survived a German camp through sheer stubbornness, and been liberated by Soviet forces in early May. He had been in Soviet custody for 7 weeks now. Morrison had started keeping a list, not because anyone told him to, because he was the kind of person who, when confronted with a situation he could not control, found something small that he could control instead. Every American he met in the camp, he wrote down. Name, rank, unit, home state if they told him. He wrote in the margins of a Soviet newspaper someone had left in the barracks. Tiny letters, economical. He had learned to write small because the space was limited and the names were not. By late June, he had more than 80 names. Some of them matched men who had been reported as killed in action. Some matched men whose families had already received telegrams saying their son was missing. Morrison did not know this. He just wrote the names because the names were real. And in a situation where almost nothing was real, that mattered. On the morning of June 24th, the guards were different. Not different people, different behavior. They were quieter. They looked west more than they looked at the prisoners. 2 of them were arguing about something in low voices near the main gate, and one of them kept pointing at the sky. Morrison did not understand Russian, but he understood the body language of men who had received news that made them uncertain. Something was happening. He did not know what. He just knew that uncertainty in a guard was the closest thing to hope that a prisoner could find. He tucked the list deeper into the lining of his jacket and waited. Back at the Soviet border, Patton maintained the pressure with the systematic patience of a man who had learned over 50 years of military life that the most effective kind of force is the kind that does not move. He ordered daily patrols along the demarcation line, artillery drills conducted visibly within range of Soviet observation posts, tank maneuvers, slow and deliberate, engines loud enough to carry across the border on a quiet morning. Not aggressive, not threatening, just constant, present, unignorable. He sent daily reports to Zhukov through military liaison channels. Each one contained the same information. The number of Americans still unaccounted for, cross-referenced against Soviet claims of completed processing. Each one was a quiet demonstration that Patton was keeping count, that the numbers did not add up, and that he had no intention of pretending otherwise. Koch was working 18 hours a day. He was cross-referencing prisoner testimonies against German camp records, against Red Cross documentation, against anything that could establish which Americans had been liberated by Soviet forces and not yet returned. The list grew. So did the discrepancies between what the Soviets claimed and what the evidence showed. On June 26th, Koch came to Patton with something new. He laid a report on the desk. It contained information from a source inside Soviet-occupied territory, a contact who had passed word through a chain of intermediaries that took 2 weeks to travel from a camp in western Poland to Koch's desk in Bavaria. The source described a separate facility, smaller, less visible than the main camps. A transit point, the source called it. Americans there, maybe 30, maybe 40, held separately from the main population, no explanation given. Patton read the report. He read it again. How reliable is the source? He asked. Koch considered the question with the precision he applied to everything. Reliable enough to take seriously, he said. Not reliable enough to act on unilaterally. Patton set the report down. He did not say anything for a long time. Then, keep digging. The first release came on June 29th. 200 Americans delivered to American lines at a crossing point near Magdeburg. They came through on foot in a loose column, moving with the particular gait of people who have been stationary for too long and are not entirely sure their legs remember how to carry them for any distance. Patton was there. He had driven to the crossing point himself without ceremony, without a press contingent, without the apparatus of a general making a public appearance. He stood at the American side of the crossing and watched them come through one by one, and he shook every hand. Some of them were young enough to be his grandsons. Some of them had the eyes of men who had been through things that age a person past what years can measure. They were thin. They were tired. A few of them were crying without seeming to notice they were crying. One of them stopped in front of Patton and looked at him for a moment without speaking. His name was Private James Morrison, 22 years old, Columbus, Ohio. He had a Soviet newspaper folded inside his jacket, covered in tiny handwritten names. "We thought nobody was coming," Morrison said. His voice was steady. It was the steadiness of someone who had decided somewhere in the previous 7 weeks that he was not going to let anyone see how close he had come to believing it. Patton looked at him. "I don't forget my men," he said, "not ever." Morrison reached into his jacket and pulled out the newspaper. He held it out. "These men," he said, "these names, they're still in there. Some of them the Soviets said don't exist, but I was in there with them. They exist." Patton took the newspaper. He handed it to Koch, who was standing 3 feet behind him. Koch looked at the names. Then he looked at Patton. Then he looked back at the names. The list Morrison had kept for 7 weeks, written in the margins of a Soviet newspaper in tiny, careful letters, contained the names of men that Koch had been searching for. Men reported dead, men reported missing, men who, according to Soviet documentation, had never existed in Soviet custody at all. They existed. They were still there. Over the following 2 weeks, the releases continued. Groups of 100, 200, 300 at a time, crossing at various points along the demarcation line. The Soviets offered no explanation for the timing, no acknowledgement of the American pressure, no statement connecting the tanks on the border to the men coming through the gates. They simply released them, quietly, without ceremony, as though this had always been the plan and nothing unusual had occurred. By mid-July, American military records indicated that the majority of documented prisoners had been returned, though the precise figures remained contested, but the numbers still did not add up. Koch worked through the documentation every day. He cross-referenced, he compared, he went back to the testimonies, back to the Red Cross records, back to the German camp registers that showed who had been held where before liberation. And when he finished, he sat down with Patton and told him what the numbers showed. "We are still missing men," Koch said. "The discrepancy between documented liberations and confirmed returns is significant. Hundreds of men, possibly more. The Soviets are claiming the process is complete. The evidence says otherwise." Patton looked at the map on the wall, the same map he had been looking at since June. "The red line, the Soviet zone, the camps, the smaller facility," he said. "The one from your contact, yes, sir, and likely others we do not know about. Deeper in, away from the main camps, away from the locations we have been monitoring." He was quiet for a long time. What the Soviets had done was not complete return. It was sufficient return, enough to demonstrate goodwill, enough to relieve the immediate pressure, enough to make the argument at the diplomatic level that they had honored Yalta. But not all of them. Not the ones in the places nobody was supposed to know about. Not the ones who had seen too much or been in the wrong place or whose names had somehow ended up on a different list in a different office that did not communicate with the office doing the releasing. Patton sent a message to Zhukov through liaison channels, formal, precise, the same tone he had maintained throughout. "We are still missing men. We have documentation. We want all of them returned, all. Zhukov's response came back within 24 hours. The process is complete. All American personnel have been accounted for. Soviet records are accurate. Patton read it. He set it down. He picked up a pen and wrote a letter to Washington, then another to the State Department, then another to the Joint Chiefs. He would write many more of these letters in the months ahead. Most of them would go unanswered because the world was already moving on. 6 days after Morrison crossed the border at Magdeburg on August 6, 1945, a single American aircraft dropped a single bomb on the city of Hiroshima, and the future arrived all at once. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and sent 1 million soldiers into Manchuria. The war in the Pacific was ending. The alliance that Eisenhower had been protecting, the alliance that had cost Patton so many months of frustration, had served its final purpose. And in that moment, in the enormous geopolitical rearrangement that followed, the question of a few hundred missing American soldiers became something that powerful people on both sides found it convenient to set aside. Not forget, set aside, which is a different thing, and in some ways a worse one. Patton kept writing his letters. Nobody was listening. August 1945. The war in Europe had been over since May. The war in the Pacific would not end until September 2nd, when Japan signed the surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri. But in August 1945, everyone could already feel it closing. The great machine of American military power, which had consumed an entire generation and remade the world in 4 years, was winding down. Soldiers were coming home by the hundreds of thousands. Ships crossed the Pacific loaded with men who had not seen their families in years. Demobilization was the word everyone used. It meant, we are done, we survived. Go home. George Patton had nowhere to go, not because he lacked a home. He had a wife, Beatrice, who had waited for him with the patient endurance of a woman who had spent 30 years married to a man who was more comfortable on a battlefield than in a living room. He had children. He had a house. He had everything that the men coming off those ships were desperate to return to. But Patton was a general without a war, and that is a particular kind of loss that does not have a clean name. On September 22nd, he gave a press conference. It was a routine event, the kind of administrative formality that filled the calendar of senior commanders during the occupation. A room full of reporters, questions about denazification, about the rebuilding of Germany, about the transition from military to civilian governance. Patton answered questions the way he always had, directly, without diplomatic cushioning, without the careful management of language that his position required and that he had never been able to fully perform. He said that the policy of removing former Nazi Party members from administrative positions in Germany was being applied too broadly. He compared the situation to American political parties, suggesting that membership in the Nazi Party had, for many Germans, been simply a matter of professional necessity rather than genuine ideology. The room went very quiet. Then it erupted. The comparison was immediately seized upon. The headlines wrote themselves. Patton defends Nazis. Patton minimizes Nazi Party membership. The general who had fought Hitler was now, according to the press coverage, excusing the people who had followed him. The reality was more complicated than the headlines. Patton's actual concern was practical, removing every former party member from German administrative positions would leave no one capable of running the water systems, the hospitals, the local governments. Germany would collapse into chaos. His argument was not moral, it was logistical, but it was expressed in the way Patton expressed everything, bluntly, without qualification, in a way that gave his critics exactly the ammunition they needed. Eisenhower called him. The conversation was brief. Eisenhower was not angry in the way Patton was angry, loudly, visibly, with the pressure showing on his face. Eisenhower was angry in the way a man is angry when he has run out of options and knows it. George, he said, I cannot protect you from this one. In early October 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army. The order was framed with the language of military administration, reassignment, new responsibilities. General Patton would take command of the 15th Army, an organization whose primary mission was the documentation and analysis of the European campaign. Historians and staff officers, reports and archives. It was, in the language of military courtesy, a prestigious assignment. It was, in every other language, the end. The Third Army was the instrument Patton had built and driven across a continent. It was the expression of everything he understood about war and movement and the particular relationship between a commander and the men who trusted him enough to follow him into places where people were trying to kill them. Taking it from him was not a demotion in the technical sense, but there is a kind of loss that the regulations do not cover, and Patton felt it with the full weight of a man who had given everything he had to one thing and was now being told politely, formally, that the thing was over. He did not argue. He did not make a scene. He accepted the reassignment with the correct military bearing and said the correct things to the correct people. But he kept writing his letters to Washington, to the State Department, to the Joint Chiefs, to anyone who would receive them. The subject was always the same: the missing men, the discrepancy between documented liberations and confirmed returns, the question that nobody was asking because asking it had become inconvenient. The letters went mostly unanswered. Private James Morrison went home to Ohio in July. He took a train from the port of embarkation to Columbus and then another train to the smaller station near his town. And when he stepped onto the platform, his mother was standing there with his younger sister and a neighbor who had known him since he was 7 years old. And none of them said anything for a long time because there was nothing to say that was equal to the moment. He had his discharge papers. He had a small bag of belongings. He had a copy of the list he had kept in the Soviet camp, written out cleanly on a piece of paper before he surrendered the original Soviet newspaper to the intelligence officers at debriefing. More than 80 names. Some of them he knew personally, some he had only met for a day or two before the releases began. Some he had never spoken to but had seen in the camp, standing in the same food line, sleeping in the same barracks, waiting with the same expression that everyone in that place wore, the expression of a person who has not stopped hoping but has become very quiet about it. He did not know what had happened to all of them. Some had been returned in the releases he witnessed. Some he had seen cross the border at Magdeburg. Others had simply disappeared from the camp population without explanation, moved somewhere else, or released through a different channel, or something else that he preferred not to think about too directly. There were names on his list that he never found any record of. He started writing letters, not to politicians, not to generals, to families. He had home states for some of them, units for most of them. He wrote to unit associations, to county newspapers, to anyone who might be able to connect a name on his list to a family somewhere who was still waiting for information. Some of the letters came back with answers. Son returned in June, missing in action, presumed dead. We received notification last spring. Some of them never came back at all. Morrison kept the list for the rest of his life. He kept it in a drawer in the house he lived in for 40 years. The house where he raised 3 children, the house where he watched the news every night, and sometimes, when stories about the Soviet Union came on, sat very still in a way that his wife learned not to interrupt. He was not a public figure. He never gave speeches about what happened. He was a man who had been in a place that most people did not know existed, who had come home and lived a quiet life and carried a piece of paper with names on it that he never quite figured out what to do with. That is most of the story of most of the men who came back from those camps. Not dramatic, not celebrated, just carried privately for decades. Robert Shaw came home in the summer of 1945. He received no special recognition for his escape from Soviet custody. No medal, no commendation, no formal acknowledgement that what he had done walking west for 3 days through Soviet-controlled territory on berries and stream water and the navigation skills his father had taught him had been anything other than a soldier doing what soldiers do. His debriefing had been thorough. His testimony had contributed directly to the documentation that Koch had used to build the case Patton sent to Schaff. His escape had been the first concrete evidence from a witness who had actually been inside that the situation was real and systematic and not a clerical misunderstanding that would resolve itself. Nobody told him any of this. He went back to Ohio, got a job, got married, had children, lived the life that the war had interrupted, and that peace allowed him to resume. He did not talk much about what had happened: the camps, the march east, the escape, the weeks in Soviet custody. It was not that he wanted to forget. It was that he understood with the practical clarity of a man who has been through something extreme and come out the other side, that most of what needed to be said had already been said to the people who needed to hear it, and that repeating it to everyone else served mainly to keep you stuck in a place you had already worked very hard to leave. He and Morrison knew each other loosely through the network of men who had been in those camps. They wrote occasionally, not often. The letters were brief, practical, the correspondence of men who shared a specific experience and understood that the experience did not require constant discussion to remain real. December 9th, 1945. Patton was in a staff car outside Mannheim, Germany. He was going pheasant hunting. It was a Sunday, gray and cold, the kind of German winter morning that looks the same whether the year is 1939 or 1945. He was in the back seat with his chief of staff. They were talking about birds, about the countryside, about nothing of particular consequence. A United States Army truck ran the intersection. The collision was not dramatic by the standards of what Patton had witnessed over the previous 4 years. No explosion, no fire, just a sudden violent impact, the physics of two vehicles meeting at an angle neither driver anticipated. The staff car was damaged but not destroyed. The truck driver was uninjured. Patton's chief of staff was uninjured. Patton was not. The force of the collision threw him forward and then back. He had no visible wounds, no blood, no broken bones that anyone could see. But something had happened in his neck, in the delicate architecture of vertebrae and spinal cord that sits at the base of the skull. And when the doctors examined him at the hospital in Heidelberg, they understood immediately that the injury was catastrophic. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He was 60 years old. He had survived the Western Front in the First War, North Africa, Sicily, France, the Bulge, Germany. He had been wounded before in the First War and had recovered. He was a man who had been in proximity to death so many times and so consistently that it had become, for those around him, almost impossible to imagine it actually reaching him. It reached him in the back seat of a staff car on a Sunday morning outside Mannheim, going to look at birds. He lived for 12 days. At the hospital in Heidelberg, he was surrounded by the medical staff of an army he had commanded, receiving care from doctors who understood that they were treating a figure of enormous historical weight and who could do, in the end, very little. The injury was not the kind that surgery could fix or medicine could reverse. The cord was damaged. The messages between his brain and his body were not getting through. Beatrice flew to Germany the day after the accident. She had spent the war waiting for the telegram that would tell her he was dead. The telegram that never came, the telegram she had probably half expected since the day she married a man who had told her, at some point in their early life together, that he intended to die in the last battle of the last war. She sat with him for 12 days. He was conscious for much of it. He could speak. He was not in extraordinary pain, which was perhaps the one mercy the injury offered. He talked with Beatrice. He talked with the doctors. He dictated a few final letters. One of them was about the missing men. He had not stopped thinking about it. Even now, in a hospital bed in Heidelberg, paralyzed 12 days from death, he was still thinking about the men whose names did not appear on any Soviet release list, whose families were still waiting, whose existence was still being denied by a government that had decided the question was closed. The letter went to Washington, like the others, into the system. No reply came before he died. On December 21st, 1945, George Smith Patton died at the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, Germany. It was early afternoon. Beatrice was with him. He had not set foot on American soil since 1944. According to his wishes, he was buried not at West Point, not in any American ceremony of national mourning, but at the Luxembourg American Cemetery, in a field of white crosses and stars of David that held the remains of 5,000 American soldiers who had died in the battles he had commanded. He had said at some point before the accident that he wanted to be with his men. He is there still. The question of how many Americans never came home from Soviet custody did not die with Patton. It simply lost its loudest voice. The Cold War settled in with the particular permanence of a new architecture, walls, and zones, and a divided world that organized itself around a confrontation so large and so constant that individual human beings became data points inside it. The missing men were a data point, a sensitive one, a complicated one, not one that either government, Soviet, or American found it useful to examine too closely. Decades passed. In 1992, after the Soviet Union collapsed and the archives began to open, a joint American-Russian commission was established to investigate the fates of American prisoners of war and missing in action from the Second World War, Korea, and Vietnam. Researchers on both sides were given access to documents that had been classified for half a century. What they found was incomplete, not because the records had been deliberately destroyed, though some had. Not because the information did not exist, though some of it clearly never had, but because the Soviet system of record keeping in the chaos of the war's end had been exactly as haphazard and inconsistent as Koch's intelligence had suggested. Forms that were never filed, transfers that were never documented, men who moved through a system so large and so disorganized that they left no trace, not because anyone chose to erase them, but because no one had chosen to record them in the first place. The commission produced reports. The reports raised questions. The questions did not receive final answers because final answers require records that in many cases no longer exist or never existed, and you cannot answer a question from nothing. The exact number of American soldiers who did not return from Soviet custody after the Second World War is not known. It has never been officially established. The range of estimates in the historical literature is wide, and the confidence intervals around those estimates are wider still. That is the honest answer, not a dramatic one, not a satisfying one, but honest. Morrison lived until 2003. He was 79 years old when he died in the same town in Ohio where he had been born, in the house he had lived in for most of his adult life. His children were with him. The list was in the drawer in the bedroom. 83 names on a piece of paper that was yellow and soft with age, written in the small, careful handwriting of a 22-year-old who had decided in a Soviet camp in Poland in the summer of 1945 that if no one else was going to remember these people, he would. His daughter found it after he died. She did not know what it was at first. She asked his oldest friend, a man who had known Morrison since before the war. The friend looked at the list for a long time without speaking. Then he said these are the ones he couldn't find. She kept the list. She does not know what else to do with it, and that is perhaps the right response to a document like that. Some things cannot be resolved. They can only be kept. There is a particular kind of soldier, and Patton was one of them, who understands that the promise made to the men under his command is not conditional. It does not expire when the war ends. It does not yield to political convenience or diplomatic necessity or the enormous indifference of institutions that have already moved on to the next problem. It is the promise that someone is coming, that you are not forgotten, that whatever it costs, someone on the other side of the wire is counting your name. Patton paid a significant price for trying to keep that promise. He was relieved of the command he had spent his life building. He was marginalized in the final months of his life. He died in a hospital bed in a country that was not his own, 12 days before he was supposed to go home. Whether his pressure changed the outcome, whether the tanks at the border and the daily messages to Zhukov and the letters to Washington made a difference to the men who came back, whether things would have been different without him, is not a question that history can answer cleanly. The diplomatic process was already moving. Other pressures were already being applied. The Cold War calculus was already shifting. What can be said is this: more than 4,800 American soldiers crossed back into American-held territory in the summer of 1945. They came through border crossings and checkpoints, thin and tired and blinking in the light of a world that had continued without them for weeks. They went home. They lived their lives. They had children and grandchildren and quiet Sundays and all the ordinary things that the war had interrupted and that they had been surviving toward. And somewhere in the distance that could not be crossed, in the part of the accounting that never resolved, there were others. Their names are not all known. Their fates are not all documented. The files that might have held the answers are incomplete or missing or sealed in archives that have not yet been opened or may never be. History records the victories, the surrenders, the parades. It is less reliable about the silences, about the men who were there and then were not, about the families who waited for a knock on the door that never came, about a soldier from Ohio who kept a list in a drawer for 58 years because he could not find any better way to honor the fact that he had been in a room with these people, that they had been real, that they had existed, that someone should know. Private James Morrison is a composite character representing the documented testimonies of multiple American soldiers held in Soviet custody in the summer of 1945. The events described reflect the historical record as established by declassified American military documents and post-war intelligence reports.